Book summary of Persuasion by Jane Austen. A captivating novel on second chances in the early 19th century. What's in it for me? Discover contemporary relevance in a classic tale. Persuasion was the last novel that Jane Austen completed. It was published in 1817, 6 months after she died. Like all of her novels, it follows the romantic and familial trials of a female protagonist, with Austen's trademark satire elevating it beyond love story to social commentary. In this audiobook, we'll trace the novel's primary plotline, the amorous ups and downs of heroine Anne Elliot. So, let's step back in time to Britain's Regency period, and to a society where the decision to marry wasn't the exclusive prerogative of the lovers it concerned. Fate twists its knife. Despite the wealth and respectability that comes with being the daughter of a baron, Anne Elliot's life had not been without hardship. 3 significant blows had led Anne to a life of loneliness and pain. The first blow came at age 14, when Anne's much-cherished mother died and, in the grips of her grief, Anne was shipped off to Bath to finish her education. Her vain and conceited father, Sir Walter, and her equally self-important older sister, Elizabeth, wouldn't have offered her any comfort during this difficult time. But Anne's relocation to Bath divided her from her godmother, Lady Russell, who always had Anne's best interests at heart. On completing her education, Anne returned to live with her indifferent family on their estate, Kellynch Hall, a grand affair surrounded by parklands for riding and hunting, carefully maintained shrubberies, and stylish gardens. The hall itself was no less impressive than its grounds. Its endless rooms were filled with rich furnishings and decorated with the latest fashions. It, and the baronetcy, were a source of great pride for Sir Walter, and he saw fit to spend his wealth on every luxury imaginable, so that his home and lifestyle reflected his rank. While this wealth greatly benefited Anne's practical needs, it proved a hindrance in matters of the heart. At age 19, Anne met a young man, Captain Frederick Wentworth, who was staying in the neighborhood with his brother. Anne was captivated by his intelligence, spirit, and depth of feeling. And Captain Wentworth was no less taken with her. Anne's bright, inquiring mind was complemented with gentleness, modesty, and elegance. And though her father saw no particular beauty in her delicate features, so unlike his own, this view wasn't shared by the captain. It didn't take long for the young people to fall in love. Anne had never known such happiness. But this felicity was short-lived. Captain Wentworth asked Sir Walter for Anne's hand in marriage. But Sir Walter did not approve. While Captain Wentworth had a certain air about him that Sir Walter couldn't deny, he had no wealth or connections. Sir Walter didn't outright refuse the captain's request. But he told Anne in no uncertain terms that if she were to accept, he would shun her henceforth. It was unthinkable that he would associate with such a lowly person as the captain and deign to be seen in public with him, even if he were his son-in-law. Lady Russell was also against the match. Though she could overlook the captain's rank to a greater degree, her concern was for Anne's ongoing comfort and well-being. Captain Wentworth may have had grand aspirations of accruing wealth, as many in the Navy did. But at such an early stage in his career, there was no guarantee that these aspirations would transpire. Stepping into the role of Anne's absent mother, Lady Russell pressed Anne not to throw herself away on the first suitor that captured her heart. And Anne, young, gentle, and in the habit of deferring to Lady Russell, allowed herself to be persuaded. Captain Wentworth's offer was duly refused, and he left the neighborhood heartbroken. Anne suffered keenly too. She lost her bloom, according to her family, and never quite recovered her spirits. While she didn't blame herself for heeding Lady Russell's advice, she greatly regretted her decision. In the years that passed, Captain Wentworth forged a distinguished career and became a wealthy man, increasing Anne's remorse. She was yet to find his equal in her limited social circle. And even if this circle were broader, it was unlikely that anyone else could so completely beguile her. This was her second great blow. The third came 8 years later, when Sir Walter's extravagant lifestyle finally caught up with him. Having accumulated formidable debt, even for someone so wealthy, he had no choice but to rent Kellynch Hall to a tenant and downsize to a respectable home in Bath. There, he could still live in a style befitting a baron, without paying for the upkeep of his estate. Anne was devastated about her removal to Bath. But this wasn't the worst of it. Kellynch Hall was rented to one Admiral Croft and his wife Sophie, Captain Wentworth's sister. This cruel twist of fate opened Anne's old wounds, as she imagined the captain's presence at Kellynch, visiting his sister. Someone still so dear to her, but now a stranger, was walking the rooms of her home. Salt in the wound. Before joining Sir Walter and Elizabeth in Bath, Anne was summoned to nearby Uppercross Lodge to care for her younger sister, Mary. Mary often fancied herself ill and in need of Anne's attention. And while Anne knew Mary's maladies were imaginary, she enjoyed the company of her little nephews, her brother-in-law Charles Musgrove, and his family, on whose estate he and Mary lived. Anne had always been at ease in the Musgroves' company. Charles's eldest sisters, Henrietta and Louisa, were lively, good-natured girls who welcomed Anne into their home as warmly as their parents did. But the close proximity to Kellynch Hall made Anne uneasy. The Musgroves were social folks, fond of inviting their neighbors to dine. It was inevitable that the Admiral and Mrs. Croft would soon take seats at their table. In no time at all, Captain Wentworth arrived in the neighborhood to visit his sister, and he and Anne were reacquainted. But the captain was cold and overly formal with Anne. After the meeting, Mary reported Wentworth saying he'd never have recognized Anne, so changed that she was. This left Anne feeling humiliated and ashamed. In the weeks that followed, Anne avoided him as much as possible, especially when it became clear that he and Louisa had struck up a rapport. During a country walk, Captain Wentworth openly praised Louisa's resolute mind, one that prevented her from being persuaded by others, and Anne felt the subtext of his words keenly. It was clear the captain hadn't forgiven her for breaking his heart. As Anne's time at Uppercross drew to a close, the young people took an overnight trip to the nearby seaside town of Lyme, where some dear friends of Captain Wentworth lived. On meeting these friends, Captain Benwick, Captain Harville, and Mrs. Harville, Anne sadly reflected that they would have been her friends too, had she married the captain. All the same, a change of scenery and the sea breeze revived her spirits, and she and the captain were better able to relax in each other's company. But on the final morning of their trip, fate dealt another blow. While jumping from the top of an outdoor staircase into Captain Wentworth's arms, Louisa fell and struck her head on the stones. The party panicked, thinking she was dead, but Anne had the composure to send for the doctor and instruct the men to carry Louisa indoors. The doctor concluded that Louisa should regain consciousness in time, and regain her health after a long period of rest. Still, Captain Wentworth was bereft. Anne saw this as proof of his feelings for Louisa. He was most certainly in love. Despite the captain stating that Anne would be Louisa's most capable nursemaid, Charles and Mary chose to stay on in Lyme to oversee her recovery. Captain Wentworth took Anne and Henrietta home, then returned to Lyme himself. Not long after, Anne traveled to her new home in Bath, where she was unlikely to see the captain. This was a huge relief. To witness him happily engaged to Louisa would be more than she could bear. A charming new acquaintance. Sir Walter and Elizabeth were excited to see Anne on her arrival in Bath, something she hadn't anticipated. They were bursting to share their news, not only about their new home but about a recently rekindled acquaintance. The heir presumptive of Kellynch Hall, Mr. William Walter Elliot, Esquire, had renewed his connection with the family after cutting ties with them years before. This surprised Anne. Mr. Elliot had nothing to gain by courting Sir Walter's favor. Unless Sir Walter remarried and his new wife bore him a son, Mr. Elliot would inherit the baronetcy and Kellynch Hall in due course, whether or not the two men were on good terms. But as Lady Russell suggested, Mr. Elliot was of a more mature mind now, and perhaps better understood the importance of close family ties. The very evening of Anne's arrival, Mr. Elliot called on the family. He and Anne realized that they had met in passing at Lyme. And while their encounter had been brief, it had made an impression. Mr. Elliot had shown Anne enough gallant admiration to catch Captain Wentworth's notice. Over the next few weeks, Anne and Mr. Elliot formed a close acquaintance. Anne enjoyed his lively conversation, and he certainly possessed the manners and refinements of a gentleman. Lady Russell was of the opinion that he intended to ask for Anne's hand. Her dearest wish was that Anne would take the place of her mother as Lady Elliot of Kellynch Hall, and marriage to Mr. Elliot would make that possible. Anne was captivated by this notion. To fill her mother's shoes and return Kellynch to its former state of elegant economy would have given her great joy. But when she thought of marrying Mr. Elliot, Anne felt uneasy. He was charming, certainly, but he wasn't open. She couldn't trust him entirely. Either way, it was not a pressing matter. Mr. Elliot's first wife had not yet been dead a year, so it was unlikely he'd propose to anyone soon. Anne had time to see how the relationship developed. But to become mistress of Kellynch on her father's death was an enticing prospect. Paths cross once more. After a month in Bath, Anne received a letter from her sister Mary that contained some unexpected news. Louisa Musgrove was still in Lyme but had recovered from her fall. And she was engaged to marry a captain. But her betrothed wasn't Captain Wentworth. It was Captain Benwick. It seemed that they had fallen in love over poetry, which Benwick had read to Louisa while she was confined to bed. Joy ruptured through Anne. Captain Wentworth would not marry Louisa. Captain Wentworth was free. She dared to hope that they would be given a second chance at happiness together. And it wasn't long before their paths crossed again. One morning, Anne, Elizabeth, and Mr. Elliot sheltered from the rain in a shop. While Mr. Elliot was out searching for a carriage to convey them home, Captain Wentworth entered the shop. He was staying in Bath with his sister and the Admiral, whose gout was playing up. It was obvious to Anne that the chance meeting had affected the captain. His usual composure was absent, replaced with embarrassment and awkwardness. Just after he'd offered Anne his umbrella, Mr. Elliot returned, all apologies and charm, to whisk Anne away. She barely had time to bid the captain a civil goodbye, and as soon as the door to the shop closed behind her, the other ladies present commented on the growing intimacy between Mr. Elliot and Anne, all within Captain Wentworth's hearing. Anne, knowing that Bath was full of gossip, was keen to re-establish a warm acquaintance with Captain Wentworth. When they both attended the same concert, she made a point of crossing the room to speak with him about Louisa and Captain Benwick. Wentworth shared with her that he was surprised by Benwick's choice. Not long before, Benwick's fiancée Fanny, who was Captain Harville's sister, had died. According to Wentworth, she had been an exceptional woman. He didn't believe that a man could, or should, recover from loving such a woman so soon. Anne was confused and gratified by this. It seemed that Captain Wentworth hadn't been in love with Louisa after all. But more importantly, his words and manner convinced her that he was still in love with her. Before she could recover from this revelation and pursue the topic, Anne was summoned back to her party. Mr. Elliot took the seat beside her and, with much flattery, alluded to their upcoming marriage by confessing that he hoped she'd remain, Anne Elliot, forever. Anne was distressed by this and became even more so when she realized that Captain Wentworth was watching her and Mr. Elliot. His expression had hardened. The next time they spoke, he was grave and formal, like he had been when they'd first met at Uppercross. Mr. Elliot drew Anne away once more, and by the time she'd escaped him, Captain Wentworth was sour. He said he was leaving, that there was nothing worth staying for. Though somewhat gratified by his jealousy of Mr. Elliot, anxiety overwhelmed Anne. When would she have the chance to speak plainly to him about how she truly felt? Anne trusts her heart. Luckily, Anne didn't have to wait long for her chance. A few days after the concert, she went to visit the Musgroves, who had come to Bath to buy wedding clothes for Louisa. On arriving, she found Captains Harville and Wentworth there too. Captain Wentworth was busily writing a letter at a nearby table. Drawing Anne to the window, Captain Harville showed her a miniature portrait of Captain Benwick. It had originally been made for his sister Fanny, on her betrothal to Benwick. Now, it was to be given to Louisa. Still grieving for Fanny, Harville couldn't bear to write the instructions for its resetting himself, so Captain Wentworth had offered to. While Wentworth wrote, Harville and Anne discussed the nature of love. They disagreed over which gender loved longest or more fiercely. Anne claimed that it was women who loved most tenderly, and who still loved when all hope was lost. She believed that women never forgot the men who had occupied their hearts. The gentleman left, but not before Captain Wentworth made it clear to Anne that he had put a note for her on the table. Fingers trembling, Anne unfolded the paper and read. It was a confession of Wentworth's deep love for her, a love that had never wavered or waned, and a renewal of his offer for marriage. Her words to Harville, which he'd overheard, had given him reason to hope. He asked Anne for a sign that she felt the same, so he'd know whether he should attend a party at the Elliots that night, or take his leave from her life forever. The letter left Anne in a state of turmoil. She desperately needed solitude to command her thoughts, but also urgently wanted to reassure the captain that he should join the evening party. On seeing that she looked unwell, Charles Musgrove agreed to escort her home. In the clutches of emotion, Anne scarcely acknowledged Captain Wentworth when they passed on the street. Luckily, Charles saw him and asked if he could take her home. He had an appointment with a gunsmith that he was loath to miss. The captain obligingly took Anne's arm. Finally alone, the reunited lovers expressed their feelings for each other and their shared wish to be married. When the captain applied for Anne's hand a second time, Sir Walter didn't object. Captain Wentworth was wealthy now and very much liked in society. Importantly, he wasn't troubled by the fact that Sir Walter couldn't pay Anne's dowry due to his sizable debt. And on closer acquaintance, Lady Russell conceded that she had misjudged the captain in the past. Anne hoped that one day, her godmother and her betrothed would be friends. But that matter could be entrusted to the future. Anne had learned that honoring her heart above the influence of others was the only path to true happiness. Final summary. So, there you have it. The story of a young woman whose happiness takes an 8-year detour because she doesn't listen to that little, inner voice that says, you know what's right for you. You might not have a godmother who takes it upon herself to butt into your dating life, but there are no doubt other forces persuading you to act against your intuition. It might be peer pressure, influencers on social media, or, like with Anne, parental expectations about how you should live your life. Perhaps the constant barrage of images that showcase so-called physical ideals, the perfect body shape or facial features, have persuaded you that you're not good enough. That, as Sir Walter supposes, you're only worth knowing if you look a certain way. But now that you've finished this book summary, you might be motivated to reflect on the cost of being persuaded by others. Like Anne, perhaps you'll find the courage and determination to make some positive changes in your life by learning to trust yourself and place less value on opinions that aren't your own.